Good afternoon, everyone. Today we will be talking about the recent developments and unrest in New Caledonia over the last few weeks. With us, we have Raga, our information manager, and Pratik, our senior analyst, and I'm Ade. Uh, so New Caledonia has been reacting with violence for the last few weeks. The state of emergency that was imposed was called off just today. And this comes after French President Emmanuel Macron had to visit the overseas territory to try to placate tensions, but that didn't go as well as he wanted. So, Pratik, why don't you give us an idea about the recent violence in uh, New Caledonia, especially in Noumea, and give us an overview of what happened? Thanks.
Thanks, Uday. So yeah, the security environment on the island remains tense, with clashes between pro-independence groups and security force personnel. In the recent series of unrest that we saw, at least 6 people, including members of the indigenous community and security personnel, have been killed. So there was widespread looting, arson, and vandalism across Nemea, and this has disrupted normalcy and movement across the city. So protesters also set up illegal makeshift blockades along several key routes. So movement was very difficult. It disrupted the supply and distribution of essential goods such as food and fuel. And this resulted in long lines outside supermarkets, and rationing also began. So several countries, including New Zealand, Australia, have launched operations to evacuate their citizens amid the continuing violence. So nickel, which is the major industry in New Caledonia, also happened to shut down operations at several of its processing plants, and the significant security deployment still continues on the island. And as you said, the French President Emmanuel Macron was visiting the island, and although he left, the security presence still remains and is likely to remain until the security situation is stabilized.
Great. So, Pratik, I mean, of course, there's the controversy over the recent law that would give French citizens who have been living in New Caledonia for 10 years voting rights in the territory. There's been controversy over that, but what are some of the underlying issues behind this violence?
New Caledonia is a former French colony that became an overseas territory in 1946. So, after decades of violence and tensions, it did gain significant autonomy under the Noumea Accords in 1998. And, that gradually set into motion a transition that would occur over a 20-year period, with the provision for 3 different referendums. These referendums were also held in 2018 and 2020, as well as 2021. While the first two resulted in the rejection of independence, the third one was boycotted, and it was based on because of the pandemic that was in place, and the indigenous community requested that the referendum be rescheduled. But because it was not, it was boycotted, and 96% of the vote was favoring the French administration and integration. So, having that background, there was already dissatisfaction among the indigenous communities over the last referendum, and the recent constitutional amendment, which was adopted by the government in Paris, effectively, expanding the electorate to include all citizens who've been there. Residing in the country for 2 years, 10 years, was kind of seen as attack on uh, the voting power of the indigenous communities. So this kind of triggered the resistance, and this also comes at a time when several pro-independence parties who are in power have been demanding for full sovereignty by 2025. So the violence stems from this background of tensions and moves by the French government in amending the constitution.
Great. So you also mentioned the nickel industry that was affected by, the riots and violence. Raga, could you jump in here and give us some background over how this plays into the bigger picture?
Certainly, Uday. New Caledonia is home to the world's fifth largest nickel reserves, and it is ranked third globally in mined nickel as of last year. And this sector is predominantly dominated by three major companies, the KNS, the PRNC, and the SLN. And these entities collectively provide about 13,000 direct and indirect jobs in the region. So it is quite a massive source of employment in New Caledonia. New Caledonia's nickel reserves comprise about 20 to 30% of the world's total. And like I said, it is a cornerstone of the local economy, and it accounts up to 90% of the exports and employs a quarter of the workforce. But most recently, the industry has faced quite a few challenges due to high energy costs and environmental concerns, which have impacted its profitability. We've especially seen this in the aftermath of the Ukraine-Russia war, where commodity pricing, just went haywire. And this has had a cascading impact on its local economy and the politics within its country, within the territory. And despite its reserves, the industry has faced a lot of economic challenges due to these production costs, and there has been stiff competition from certain countries like Indonesia, which have produced cheaper nickel. Global prices have fallen by more than 45% due to the flooding of nickel into the market, so to speak, and that has impacted the country's income, and therefore it's threatened to shut the three main nickel processing plants that I spoke about earlier. So this downturn directly impacts the Kanak indigenous community, which is mainly employed in the mining industry. And the Kanaks have expressed their demands for a greater share of the industry's profits. And for a large part, they have felt that they've not quite benefited or had a share of these certain profits. And they've also expressed a demand for the decision-making power for mining on their lands. And these decisions have not really come through, and their demands have translated into certain demonstrations which went violent back in 2020. There were some demonstrations over the proposed sale of the Brazilian owned Vale nickel mine in Goro. There were a lot of protests in the capital Nomea, with pro-independence Kanak groups opposing the sale and trying to take over the mine and block roads. So the essence of this entire conflict, or this clash, is the concentration of wealth among French and multinational corporations who typically benefit from the island's nickel sources versus the Kanaks, who often ask for a greater share of the profits. So that's the background of the nickel industry in New Caledonia.
Right. Right. So the Canucks are not only asking for a share of the profit, but also increased political representation too. And this whole crisis that has gone on right now, in a way, it was somewhat predictable because the French government continued to not take into account Kanak leaders and their perspectives and the New Caledonian government. So with that being said, Pratik, Raga, if we could just close this off, if you could just give a little bit on how you see things developing, or a short-term or medium-term outlook at the moment.
Yeah, there. So basically, the path forward is basically dependent on two major developments that we'll look forward to. One is the political development, and the second is regarding the economy. So firstly, to discuss the political developments. So the issue which triggered this violence recently is now looking at a stalemate where there's no breakthrough in negotiations. Uh, even though Emmanuel Macron was in New Caledonia and the groups did not arrive at an agreement. So for the most part, the pro-independence groups have asserted that withdrawing that constitutional amendment would be the first step to opening up negotiations regarding other issues. They've called on the French authorities to establish a dialogue mission and allow for sufficient time for this negotiation to take place in good faith without any constitutional change hanging over the head. And the political dissatisfaction among the groups, you know, has is multifaceted, and there are going to be other issues and concerns of multiple a whole spectrum of groups that need to be addressed before this goes any further. Having said that, if the French government in Paris decides to impose this constitutional amendment as is without negotiations or without any considerations, that could further spark violence across the archipelago and especially in Noumea. And that is going to be the kind of situation we'll be looking to in the coming months. Raga, you want
All
to
right.
comment on the economy?
Yeah. So as to the economy, it's quite important to know what has actually happened in the recent crisis. A lot of businesses in Noumea have faced devastating losses due to the violence and unrest, and a lot of establishments, small and big, were either looted or set ablaze, and that has dealt a blow to the local economy. And some estimates from the government data suggest that the economic loss is near about $218 million, but these still do not fully account the public infrastructure damage or the ongoing operational losses since the state of emergency was imposed. So when we look at one side of things, it is that the small establishments to big establishments have been quite severely impacted. And on the other side, we see that the crisis within nickel itself has pushed global nickel prices to over 20,000 US dollars per ton. And in response to these challenges, the French government has pledged support to sustain the nickel industry operations through subsidies. But the path forward remains quite challenging because of the ongoing economic and political complexities. Because although there is a slump, the demand for nickel remains quite high, and certain agencies have predicted a tripling of global demand over the next 2 decades. And the reliance of the country's economy on nickel will ensure that it will remain a central theme to the political dynamics within New Caledonia. And reviving the nickel industry is quite crucial and will be the hinging factor for the political stability. Nickel mines and processing mines within New Caledonia have already been rescued repeatedly through bailouts earlier, and there have been talks of bailouts even over the last year. And several have halted operations over the course of the recent months with the challenges that we spoke about earlier because of losses of billions of dollars. So reviving the industry is where the French government is going to be looking at, because reviving the industry is going to be quite challenging as it requires a lot of investments in the tune of billions of dollars, as well as cooperation from Kanaks. So it's not purely an economic issue, it is also a political issue. It's going to require engagement on all fronts, and not addressing this issue can lead to the economy in ruin because it will exacerbate the ongoing political tensions and lead to more violence and reduction in investments. So that's what the
Right.
future looks like for New Caledonia.
That's a pretty grim picture, but I think it's pretty realistic, especially given that France has not been able to deal with the situation that well, and this is not the first time that violence has broken out over similar issues. So yeah, thanks a lot for joining us today, Raga and Pratik, and to everyone listening on this. We'll see you on a call later this week. Thanks again.
Thanks for that.